Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. I'm Amanda Claiborne. I'm a professor in the English department, and I'm currently serving as the Dean of Undergraduate Education, and it is my honor and privilege to welcome PEN America to this campus. But before I do that, before I turn the lectern over to them, I do just want to pause for a second to pay tribute to another group who has done important work in this area. And that's the group of students who started meeting with the dean of our college, Rakesh Khurana, back in 2020, to confess to him a certain disappointment in how their college experience was going. They would say to him first one-on-one, individually, and then slowly in groups, that they were missing out on something they had come to college to have. They didn't feel like they were having the kinds of conversations they wanted. They found themselves surrounded by people from all around the world and all walks of life, and yet they didn't quite know how to talk to one another across lines of difference. In their classrooms, they were confronting incredibly challenging ideas and discoveries, and yet they found classroom discussion converged all too quickly on a single point of view. And so they felt the lack of of a crucial part of their education. And as they described this lack, they started to describe, as in a kind of photo-negative, a vision of what they wanted their college education to be. And they ultimately articulated that vision in a statement calling for what they named intellectual vitality. That's a phrase I think you're going to hear a lot today and tomorrow, intellectual vitality. And that call for intellectual vitality was galvanizing for us, for the faculty and administrators in the college. We were persuaded that this is a challenge that we should all be working together to meet, and that this, in fact, should be the college's top priority. And we've been able to act on that priority because of the generosity of some very loyal alumni who remember with a lot of deep respect and regard the kinds of conversations they were able to have when they were here. Because of their generosity, we are now able to launch intellectual vitality initiatives across the college, in our classrooms, in our clubs, and in our teams, and in our residential spaces, in our yards and in our houses. We're also able to host public events, the first of which is this. And so we are incredibly grateful to the generosity of our alumni who are making this possible, and we are grateful, too, to those of you who came from outside Harvard to join us in this work. We have so much to learn from what's going on other campuses as we do from PEN America. So let me turn now to PEN America and introduce my colleague, Kristen Cheverdian. Kristen is based in New York, where she leads campus engagement and public events on free expression, and we're so delighted to be collaborating with you. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much, Amanda. Welcome to tonight's panel event, Combating Censorship, Disinformation, and Hate. My name is Kristen Cheverdian, and I am the Senior Manager of Free Expression and Education at PEN America. PEN America stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. We're a 100-year-old organization that champions the freedom to write, recognizing the power of the word to transform the world. Our mission is to unite writers and their allies to celebrate creative expression and defend the liberties that make it possible. Our strength is our membership. A nationwide community of writing professionals, as well as devoted readers and supporters who join with them to carry out PEN America's mission. You can find out more about our events, advocacy efforts, and about joining PEN America at pen.org. PEN America partners with schools, colleges, professional organizations to facilitate workshops, convenings, public events, and educational programs. Through our professional development programs and our campaigns against educational gag orders, we work to bridge divides on campuses and to defend students and teachers against legislative infringements on free expression in the classroom. We began planning this summit back in August when Dean of Students Thomas Dunn and Intellectual Vitality Director Camila Nardozzi reached out to us for a conversation on how PEN America's programming could intersect with the mission of intellectual vitality and the commitment to free speech and open inquiry at Harvard. Working closely with them over many months, together we curated this evening's keynote panel and tomorrow's student summit. Throughout the day tomorrow, we will be engaged in a series of workshops with students on topics ranging from cancel culture to protest rights to academic freedom. The day will begin with a keynote address by Keith Whittington, professor of politics at Princeton University. One note about the structure of tonight's panel. After our panelists engage in discussion led by our moderator, we will open the floor up to questions from the audience. Since this event is designed as a kickoff for our student summit tomorrow, we will be prioritizing questions from students during the Q&A period. Now, let us begin tonight's program. We're thrilled that you are all able to join us this evening for what I know will be an engaging and important conversation about speech on college campuses. Our panelists this evening are Suzanne Nossel, CEO of PEN America. She is a leading voice on free expression issues in the United States and globally, writing and being interviewed frequently for national and international media outlets. She's also a graduate of both Harvard College and Harvard Law School, and the author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Also joining us is Randall Kennedy, the Michael R. Klein Professor of Law at Harvard Law. Awarded the 1998 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award for Race, Crime, and the Law, Mr. Kennedy writes for a wide range of scholarly and general interest publications. A member of the American Law Institute, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Association, Mr. Kennedy is also a trustee emeritus of Princeton University. And rounding out our panel is John W. Boyer, the Senior Advisor to the President and the Martin A. Ryerson Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of History. He also served as Dean of the College from 1992 through June 2023. He served as editor of the Journal of Modern History since 1980 and published The University of Chicago, A History, with the University of Chicago Press in October 2015. He was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Vienna in 2015 in recognition to his scholarly work on the Habsburg Empire. And finally, our moderator tonight, Rakesh Khurana, the Danoff Dean of Harvard College since 2014. Rakesh Khurana is a professor of sociology and organizational behavior at Harvard University and former faculty dean of Cabot House. And now I will turn our attention to Rakesh Khurana and our panelists to begin tonight's event. Thank you so much.
All right, good evening. Aw, good evening. The first time when I was first professor at MIT, I said like good morning to my students and they just like wrote it down, and so I got a little nervous. It's really great to see everyone here, and I just want to add my thanks. We know it's really cold outside for people to come over today, and we know also you're taking time out of either a break or coming to school a little early or have traveled here. And I just want to add my thanks how grateful we are for our students who are here from the college, but also Harvard College, and also the students who are here from across many universities. We have so much to learn from each other, and just really, really grateful. So I want to add my thanks for that. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel. These are amazing individuals, people I have deep admiration for. So as we said, we don't want to be talking at you. We want to be talking with you. So kind of what we were thinking about is that I have some introductory remarks to kind of frame some of the conversation. We have a few questions to really, engage. And I know these colleagues. You're going to see people not agreeing with each other here. So just want to let you know. But I think it's actually really important, given the moment that we're in. I always start like our discussions, and anybody who's ever like met me, like with the mission of Harvard College. But I think it's a mission that actually probably resonates with a lot of people's schools, which is the mission of Harvard College is to educate the citizens and citizen leaders for our society. And we do this through our belief in the transformative power of an education. And we talk about things like an intellectual transformation, which is new ways of knowing, new ways of understanding, all toward the goal of developing an independent mind. We want our students to learn to think for themselves. We embed that, as was mentioned, as Amanda mentioned earlier, in very diverse living experiences, like all of the ones that schools that you all attend, where people come from different walks of life and have different identities, evolving identities, which we believe deepens that intellectual transformation, new ways of knowing and understanding, but also leads to what we call a social transformation, our understanding of what it really means to be part of a community, that a community is not just a collection of individuals, and that dialogue is not simply the exchange of claims and counterclaims, where really the goal is to sort of deepen our understandings of each other, to see behind each other's eyes, to hear from somebody else's perspective. And then through those experiences, we hope our students begin to answer questions for themselves. Who am I and who do I want to be? How do I relate to others and what can I learn from others? What are my gifts and talents and how can I best use them to serve the world? So what we call a personal transformation. And I know every higher education institution has some version of those goals. And I think what we want to do is we think those goals are not just important for us as institutions or as individuals, but for as a society. We live in a very pluralistic, diverse society. And higher education is one of the mechanisms by which we help contribute to that democracy, to contribute to a better world. And obviously, it goes without saying that we're under incredible stress right now. Some of our core values as an institution, as higher education, are in incredible stress. Last year, there was a poll that was done that's been a long-standing poll on trust in and people's views about college and higher education. And for the first time last year, 55% of Americans said they didn't necessarily believe college was good for the nation. That's a serious change, because only a decade earlier, this has always been a bipartisan, shared commitment, often in the 85–90% level. And obviously we don't want to read too much into it, but we also can't ignore it. What it means if people distrust one of the many institutions that are charged with supposedly speaking truth to power, trying to give an accurate view of the world, tries to produce research that can be seen as useful and objective, if that's part of the view. A lot of people are disentangling where all of this has come from. For some people, it looks like institutions like ours are places where they're very expensive, they're out of reach, they don't connect, and we know all about college debt and those type of things. So higher ed is caught as that. And there's another perspective that actually, as much as we espouse open expression and free thought and being hard on the problem and easy on each other, that's not actually what's happening on campuses, that there's a much more a tendency toward conformity, or if there are differences, people don't feel comfortable speaking about them or know how. And so I think the work that we all have to do, but particularly, and it is collective work, I think has never been more important. Our own university, like a few others, has gone through and is going through a very difficult moment, a kind of reckoning in a lot of ways. And the question, I think, for us is how do we use this moment to come out better and stronger, with our values intact, and maybe even higher levels of commitment. So grateful to everybody here who's participating in that. So with that, I would love to just open up a couple of questions. One is, as we look at this moment around free expression, which has been something that has been debated and discussed about what's happening in higher education, why it's so critical or important to higher education and universities. I would love to start with anybody who wants to jump in, actually, maybe Professor Kennedy, about what you're thinking around free expressions and its role in the university as a faculty member, as somebody who is an educator.
Well, thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be with everyone this evening. Freedom of expression is absolutely essential. And if we're talking about a we're talking about an educational institution. Well, how can you maintain a decent educational institution without people being able to express themselves and express themselves freely? We learn to think through expressing ourselves. And it's not just a matter of a speaker, there is the listener. So freedom of expression, thought about capaciously, freedom to read, freedom to listen, that's absolutely central to the university. And so we have to be very attentive to it at all times, but particularly now, given the circumstances to which you alluded.
And if you don't mind, Professor Kenny, is it okay if I just call you Randy?
That's fine.
More informal. What are those circumstances that you see?
Well, you mentioned one. I mean, this diminished respect, this diminished trust in the university. I'll say, by the way, that you asked, where does that come from? I think that the universities have problems. The university, this university, all universities have problems. I mean, they're human institutions. Humans are frail. Humans have problems. Humans have vices, and so we need to be self-critical. It seems to me we also need to recognize, however, how special universities are. And I think that university people, one problem, as far as I'm concerned, is that members of universities have not been as willing as they should be to champion the ethos of the university, and while being critical, also stand up for the good of the university. Where else in American life or anywhere, where else is there more openness than in the university? Where else is there more welcoming for all sorts of people, including the most excluded people in our society? So the universities need to work on various things, but university people also need to be willing to stand up and champion and, if necessary, fight for the good things that animate universities, including this one.
Thank you. Suzanne?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm really glad we're having this conversation right now. I'm a proud alum. I really care about this institution. It's been a huge part of my own life. And I think Harvard is in an unprecedented crisis. And it is, some of it's in common with other institutions around the country, but there's a kind of unique focus here because of how things have played out. The fate of Claudine Gay, the role of alumni and of students, and just this intense contestation that is afoot right here on campus. And what I hope is that this can be a catalyst, because I agree with you that free expression it's fundamental to the student experience. Campuses are the first place that most students encounter people from vastly different backgrounds. We remain a very segregated country. Our high schools are overwhelmingly still kind of significantly segregated, not de jure, and not entirely, but substantially. And so you come to campus, and that's where you learn to encounter and work with people unlike yourself, from different racial backgrounds, gender identities, socioeconomic backgrounds, ideologies, political viewpoints. And we have to make that work. The university is an incubator for our pluralistic democracy, and that democracy is being gravely challenged right now at a moment of unprecedented polarization. And for me, what's clear is this central feature of the university and the function of the university, I think we've neglected. We've taken it for granted. It has not been a deliberate part of what has been inculcated in the culture here. I mean, I look and I think of when I was a student, what has changed? A number of things. sexual harassment now, you can't become a freshman here or anywhere without understanding what sexual harassment is, what's permitted, what isn't, why the university protects against it, what the policies are, what will happen if you breach them. Sustainability, every classroom has, full-on recycling and, guidance about how this university is going to be sustainable. I know every dining hall, every house has the same. So the university has sort of taken those things on and woven them into the lifeblood in overt ways so that you can't be here, whether as a student, a faculty member, on staff, without understanding what it's all about, that it's a core value, how you can realize it. I think it needs to be the same when it comes to free speech and academic freedom. And those concepts are complicated. It's going to take real effort. It's not as simple as a canned video that you can show someone online and believe that you've done your job. It's got to be part of what is introduced when people first come to campus. It has to be repeated in the classroom. Residential advisors need to understand what the boundaries are. Security people need to know how to enforce them when it comes to a protest or a demonstration on campus. And so I think it's quite a comprehensive re-envisioning of how to really instantiate the place of free speech and academic freedom. It's clear, we've lost the thread, not just here, but that young people, overwhelmingly, they don't feel they can express themselves. There are other surveys that show that the understanding of the ability of students to, for example, recite the 5 freedoms enshrined in the First Amendment, I think it's less than 20% who could name, I think, even 1 or 2. And so we have a lot of work to do. And I hope this moment of crisis can become the catalyst to take this on. And Harvard really, could be a leader here, because I think it is so elemental to the university's values. And, what happens at Harvard and the disposition of this crisis is going to be watched not just across the country, but all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So a lot of advice we're getting is to be more like the University of Chicago. So John, thank you for being here. John Boyer was the dean. He was the dean of the college at University of Chicago for more than 30 years. He has been a mentor and friend to many deans in this undergraduate role for a long time. What do you see from your vantage point? Because you're not only were you a kind of participant as a kind of historian of higher ed and as a thinker, like how would you respond to how did we get here, or do you see a challenge here? Is it a cultural issue? Is it a set of Chicago principles and Calvin reports that we should be adopting? What's your view, John?
Okay. Thanks for inviting me. I didn't go to Harvard. I actually was once offered a job and turned it down. So
I didn't get into Harvard as an undergrad. I just want to make that clear. It's easier to become dean.
I'm here as a guy who well, anyway, I went to another school, but anyway. I want to say, first of all, Harvard is a very great university and it will survive, with all due respect to the crisis. And I don't mean to diminish the crisis, but I think, universities have been dealing with challenges to free expression for 100 years with the Red Scares and, McCarthy and the 1930s. And this is peculiar and different, but I don't think it's any worse than those previous scares. The world may be worse. I think Randy's point about the universities, in a sense, we've allowed ourselves to get into kind of defensive mode. And I think it's important to kind of go back to first principles. So in my mind, at least in my university, and this in some way, I don't want to give a lecture on the Calvin report, although I'd be happy to do that if you want me to. But the universities are Rakesh has this wonderful citizen leaders of the world. Okay, and I remember when we were debating this. Someone said, like, well, "What do you do in Chicago?" I said, "We educate young scholars." Okay, now those are rather different things to do, although the universities are not that different. And my mantra, educating young scholars, it's not that everybody's going to go on to get a PhD, because that would not be a very good, wise thing to do nowadays in terms of the labor market. But the universities are ultimately places that are crucibles and laboratories of ideas, and the ideas lead to knowledge. And free expression came into existence long time ago because scholars, faculty like us, thought that we needed to have the freedom to experiment with ideas, and then gradually the students were involved and invited into that project. And so by the 1920s and 30s, you have these norms that stipulate that students and faculty will be free for the purposes of doing the academic work of the university, not necessarily to become something after college, but actually to do what is essential to the meaning of the university. And I think this applies across the universities, not just undergraduate colleges. I think the way we talk about these issues have to address and take cognizance of the whole of the university, not simply in the undergraduate program. And what I'm kind of worried about, Amanda Klein, when she introduced, she alluded to the fact that you were some of your students are saying that these problems are apparent in the classroom. It's not simply like, out there are people, evil people are saying bad things about you on, in social media, somewhere across the river or something like that. And I think that for me, one of the concerns I have is not that we need free expression to protect liberal education, but rather I'd flip it around. We need liberal education to protect academic freedom. And I think that the current crisis could be a useful one in bringing back to the adults in the room. I mean, we're all adults, but in some ways, the owners of the university, at least in the way we think of it, is the senior faculty. It's the faculty who are responsible for having a rigorous and systematic and disciplined curriculum that models, and not only models, but empowers students to have the kind of skills to debate and to value difference and debating ideas. If the academic world of the university is not doing that, then like, what are we doing? We just exist to raise money and so forth, or to become famous. So I think that this issue of the relationship of the academic responsibilities of the faculty and the academic responsibilities of the students to these issues is really of paramount importance. And I'd be happy to talk about the Calvin report too.
Yeah,
but
it's fine. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. Like, why do people come to universities? Is kind of in some ways. I mean, a few months ago we had kind of a family weekend, and I was talking to some parents, and they were saying to me, "I'm so glad my child is here." And they're going on, and I was very happy for them. And they were saying, I just love everything that the college is doing for them, et cetera. And I said, you must really love academic freedom and tenure. And they're like, what? And I said, well, those are the two distinctive features of a university. And in a strange way, and this is maybe going to the earlier points, a lot of people want to be at a college or a university. They think it's a good thing, but they're not sure why it's different than other than maybe getting a job, or meeting some new friends, or, and I think if I understood you correctly, Randy, we haven't done a good job explaining ourselves. We've kind of become central in a society without a lot of people understanding us. But why has John, you're saying the faculty has to take ownership of this. Like, one of the things that we've learned is a lot of times faculty feel like they're walking on eggshells. It's not just students who are walking on eggshells about talking about things. The faculty feel this. So how can we resuscitate this important quality, which is, I think each of you have alluded, is distinctive to what makes a university, or a college, and an education so critical? How do we instantiate that, those responsibilities? Randy?
Well, I think we need to talk realistically about discussion, conversation, disagreement. And here, I find myself being in some degree of disagreement with people with whom I'm allied. I think of myself as part of the, sort of the free expression camp, and I am in the free expression camp, but I have colleagues and friends who say things like, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. I feel like I'm silenced. I can't say what's on my mind. And I must say, from time to time, I get rather impatient, and I say to somebody, well, what? Do you think that somebody's going to throw you in the gulag? I get the impression sometimes that people want to enter debates and they want everybody to acquiesce to what they have to say. Now, if you enter a debate about a volatile subject, it seems to me you've got to accept that there are going to be people who are going to disagree with you. Now, if you say something and somebody disagrees with you, and somebody disagrees with you strongly, and not only do they disagree with you, but just suppose their friends disagree with you, well, you know, you're in a debate. And, you know, you say something, they say something, you say something back, maybe voices get raised, maybe there's, you know, some tension. That's part of a good discussion. That's part of debate. And I think that you can't have a good discussion and expect it to be frictionless, expect it to just, you know, have a happy smile all the time. I think realism a realistic debate requires an acceptance that there's going to be discomfort. And frankly, sometimes there might be, you know, some bitterness, some hard feelings. That comes with freedom of expression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he was my professor, so I remember some of those great discussions that we had in class. And you know, if we were back in class, you know, circa late 1990s, you know, that's how it was. And you could have that give and take, and you could duke it out and argue, and then go to lunch and move forward. But I think we have to recognize some aspects that have changed. I think people are, you know, we have a much more diverse campus population. We have no single racial majority on most campuses now, and that will be the case for our population at large. And, you know, that's demanded a lot of adaptation. And, you know, the DEI is the term that gets used, although that adaptation long predates that acronym, and it was afoot when I was here as a student, beginning to think about how the university needed to address a student population that was different from the one that Harvard was founded for centuries ago, a largely homogenous group of elite white men. And, you know, in the course of that adaptation, there are factors and forces that have inhibited that free flow of ideas. I mean, one is the fear of being labeled, whether it's as a bigot, a transphobic, racist, like those labels weigh enormously heavily. You know, it makes you into a pariah. It stigmatizes you. It also lasts. It's not like you walk out of the classroom and that's it. Somebody may have caught it on video. They could tweet it out. It could become, you know, something that registers online and is with you possibly for the rest of your life, for all we know. It can be algorithmically amplified so that, you know, in a matter of hours or days, it's transmitted all over the world. Everybody you know has heard about it. Thousands of people have picked up on it. And so, you know, the question is, how do we get back to the ability to have those free-flowing, invaluable conversations in an environment where all of this is afoot? And I think it takes a lot more work and effort. I think when you could do it in person, there's a great advantage to that. I think having phones in the classroom and allowing people to sort of record and capture what's being said can be inhibiting, and you know, that's something that we should look at. And there also is, you know, and you touched on this, kind of this element of how speech lands and resiliency and the idea that speech can cause harm. And kind of traditionally as a free speech defender, you don't want to admit that speech can cause harm because the minute you do so, you're kind of opening the door to censorship. I've argued that, look, under some circumstances, you know, people who are subjected to slurs and prejudice their whole life, that can cause harm. And I talk about it in my book. There's documented evidence that it can affect you psychologically, academically, even physically. So that's true. But it's also true that those harms can be exaggerated, projected, sort of imagined, and overemphasized. And I think this kind of language and currency of harm has become chilling and silencing, and it's become a factor that inhibits those classroom discussions. I mean, back, you know, when I was at the law school, people still idealized, you know, the championing of the Nazis marching in Skokie and the idea that even those noxious ideas, the ACLU and this group of attorneys sort of stepped forward and defended their right to be there, even in a community of Jewish people and Holocaust survivors. And implicit in that was the idea that those Jewish people and Holocaust survivors had to endure that. They were going to have to, the march never ended up taking place, but the premise of defending the right of those Nazis to march was that, people have to develop and exhibit the resiliency to contend with speech that may be triggering, menacing, upsetting, offensive. And I think that's something that we've lost. And I think it doesn't mean we endorse those forms of speech. It doesn't mean we don't want people to be conscientious and exercise care with language. I think those things are critical. But I do think there's also an element of how we acculturate people to being in an environment where not everything you hear is going to be comfortable, and learning how to understand and modulate your own reaction to that.
Suzanne, can I ask a follow-up on that? Okay, what would be your counter-argument to what you just said?
Yeah, there's counter-arguments from both sides. I mean,
but if you have to just make the argument from what you just challenged the view that, like, around, say, sustained people making comments about an individual because of their identity or the group they belong to on a day-to-day basis, and hearing that every day, could one make an argument that shuts down learning rather than enhances it? I would just love to see the strongest form of the argument that you just argued against.
Here's how I think about it, Rakesh. I think, in my book, I sort of lay out principles for how I think we can live together in our diverse, digitized, and divided society without curbing free speech. And I kind of begin with 5 principles when you're in your role as a speaker, and 5 when you're in your role as a listener. And I think kind of sustaining free speech in the 21st century requires each of us to take on some responsibilities. I do think we have an obligation to try to use language conscientiously, to know who's in our audience, how are our words going to land, how do people like to be referred to, what terms are considered archaic or anachronistic and might therefore be offensive. Like, that's an obligation, I think, of living in a pluralistic society. That, it's not censorship. I mean, we all are thoughtful when we're engaging with our family or our friends. We don't say everything that comes to our mind. We're conscious of how it may be received, what this person's sensitivities are, and that's part of living in a diverse society, that you've kind of got to have a certain threshold level of awareness of that, vis-a-vis all different kinds of people who you're going to encounter on campus. And so I think if we respect that duty and we uphold that duty and we help people recognize, what it entails, then there will be actually more tolerance for speech at the edges, speech that may rankle, may cause people to bristle. I also think for a speaker, you're trying to get a point across. You're trying to persuade people of something. You want them to hear out your point of view. So if you use offensive language, or you distract people with a comparison or an analogy or a term that they find objectionable or that triggers them, you actually stand in your own way, because that throws the conversation off track. The person becomes distracted. They start to distrust you. They think you have a different set of values, and they don't hear what you're saying. They're not as open to it. So I see these principles as kind of interlocking, and I don't think it's as simple as any one sort of solution. I think there are obligations that are incurred on all sides, and that's why it has to be a much more deliberate and kind of effortful endeavor on the part of the university to instantiate this culture.
John, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, if we end up in 20 or 30 years from now at a university where everybody thinks the same way and is afraid to talk, and this kind of dystopian, it would be a kind of a rather sad state of affairs. I think we ought to give all the money back, right, to all these people who are trying to tell us what to do by giving them money. It seems to me that, again, to come back to the responsibility of the faculty, you can imagine an ideal, a utopian college, none of ours, but an even better one, okay, if there could be a better one, or ones, and in which young people come, and this first year is an intensive and systematic introduction to how to talk through complex and controversial issues across the humanities, the social sciences, the humane sciences, and so forth. And then you do it one semester, and you do it again and again. And so that in other words, you're using the curriculum, and you're using the potency and the creativity and the courage of the faculty, because free speech also has to be fearless speech. You can't just be free. If it's not fearless, it's not really free. And so you then end up with upper class students who are accustomed to this style. It's kind of like a habits of learning, style of learning. And so you then end up with in these points of controversy, which may come in some classes and may not come in other classes at all. So that at large, on a kind of macro level, you end up with a student culture that feels comfortable with living with the excitement of ideas, which makes going to college interesting, as opposed to being bored to death by sameness. I think this can be done.
Yeah, no. I you know what's interesting? I like the direction you're going in, and I think it was also, Suzanne, where you were kind of going, which is, why do we always frame this in the negative space rather than the positive space? That what is it that free expression allows us to do? In a university in particular, it allows us, if I heard you correctly, one is suppressing expression is the original form of oppression. Right? It's like you talked about the fundamental freedoms. It is the original form of oppression is not allowing someone to speak or write or say something. The second thing you said is, how can we know what we believe unless we're able to dialogue about it? So it's also a way of discovering our own beliefs, because otherwise you're just sort of in your own brain, your own mind. You have no sense of validation. Third is, so it helps you form your identity. It helps you so I'm wondering if there's it helps you discover through argumentation what is a more accurate or better way, or if you're trying to persuade others that you think you have some insight. So I'm wondering if one of the opportunities we have actually is to take exactly what you were saying, and how do we frame this in the positive space? Because I think often when you go right to the corner case, I don't think we want to be a place where we're always operating in the corner case but rather actually in the space where it's actually liberating, enabling, empowering, energizing, has the power to move the world, right? Nothing moves the world better than a new idea. And I'm wondering if part of what we're struggling with is, in fact, what free expression means in sort of the body politic, and where you can sort of rant on a corner is different than the responsibilities of what it means when you're in a university trying to somehow get at truth or something approximating the truth. I don't know, does that resonate, or am I sort of in the wrong view on that?
Resonates with me, but, and I think in a way it resonates too much, in the sense that,
because it's not as aggressive as
yeah,
what you
people will agree with what you just said. I think, great mass of people will agree with what you just said. It's only when there is the volatile situation that the rubber hits the road. It's only when people really disagree with one another that, what we're talking about becomes, an issue.
Yeah.
And that's why we go to the, the corner case. It's the corner case that makes us really have to grapple with, a tremendous dilemma.
I was just thinking, listening to both of you, do you still have the QRR here?
The Q guide for the...
No, it was the quantitative reasoning requirement.
Yeah, yes, we do.
Yeah, it's this course that everybody has to take.
It's now quantitative reasoning with data.
It's been rebranded. So, what about a course that's debating difficult ideas? And it's a required course, and you take on, whether it's immigration or abortion or issues of race, gender, some of the really contentious issues. And you walk students through what it's like to take different positions on this, how you can articulate a point of view without offending someone, how to take into account the counter arguments, how to respond when you feel triggered, how you come back, how you, discipline yourself to continue with the dialogue. I think that's the level at which I think the university is going to, some version of that. It can't be a one-off. It has to then, I think, be reinforced as you, move on to higher level classes, to rebase those principles at the beginning of the semester and, reinforce them in the dining hall or in student protest. But I think that's the kind of, it has to become a much more deliberate, intentional piece of what is done here if we want to bring back kind of the conversations that we remember and that your students are hungry for, as Amanda was saying and as they reflected in those survey responses.
I agree. It can't be abstract, though. So, for instance, at the law school, there's orientation, and from what I gather, there are these discussions about, these meta discussions, how to have a difficult conversation. Frank, I get impatient. You learn how to have a difficult conversation by having a difficult conversation. So let's pick out a subject, just like you were suggesting, and then get into it. And then as you're into it, there might come points at which you stop and you say, well, let's reflect on what we're doing here. I just said something. Are you listening to what I said, or are you just trying to create a straw man, not listening to what I said? And how do I respond to you? And, I made a point. I just conceded that you made a really good point that's going to make me have to rethink my point. What about, you go back and forth, but I think it has to be really concrete. And I wouldn't run away. So, for instance, you were saying, I wouldn't run away from, a little bit of bad feeling, hurt feeling. I'm upset. There are worse things. I mean, I really do think that, if you're talking about something about which people really disagree, again, it's not going to be frictionless. It's not going to be, all smiles. And it may very well be that you have conversations, and there's some conversations, you have the conversation, and that's right, you go to dinner afterwards. There's sometimes you have a conversation, and you don't want to go to dinner afterwards. But, maybe next week we reassemble. But again, I think we need to be realistic about what real engagement means. And I don't think that we're going to get over the hump if we're sentimental.
Right. Well, I'm not sure right now whether I want to go to dinner tonight with you. No, I agree with that, actually. And I think it's, it's also how do you come back? If you have a really contentious exchange and it gets heated, what happens in between that class and the next class? How do you get the tools to, so that you can continue in the course together? I think that I absolutely agree. It's got to be practiced. It can't be preached. It's got to be interactive. It has to be real life examples. You have to create an environment where kids can actually express themselves. I would ban phones in that class and ensure that it really is a direct dialogue. And if people have that experience, what we find, if our team here is doing this summer tomorrow, is that when you introduce young people to the ideals of free speech and kind of what it's about and what it feels like to have that robust give and take, they're inspired. Even if they kind of came into the room thinking, free speech is a smokescreen for hatred, it's that which protects the speech I disagree with or the person who's offended me. Once they come to realize what it's like to be able to debate ideas, to push back, to assert yourself, to have to reconsider what you've said and figure out how to, what part of your position to give up and what part you're going to cling on to. It's a very dynamic, engaging experience. I think, it could end up being, right at the top of the Q Guide as a favorite course.
Well, I'm sorry to do this, but I have to say the core curriculum. What I mean by that, Chicago's famous, along with Columbia, for having not given up a core curriculum. And so we spent actually the first year and a half with our students actually doing very systematic learning and team-taught learning over large swaths of the humanities and social sciences, teaching people to think up through difficult texts, and it's done with everybody. There's no place to hide, and they also have to take calculus too. So, but that's a little different. You know, and the ethos of our core is really dominated by the humanists, because among many ills and things that are afflicting us now, our afflictions that we're carrying on our backs, is not simply the free expression thing, but also the crisis of the humanities and the crisis of liberal arts. Okay.
You think
they're
related?
All connected, in my mind. They're all connected. And as a historian, as a humanist, although I'm technically a social scientist, but in Chicago, I'm really a humanist. It seems to me this is an extraordinary opportunity for the humanists of the United States to stand up and be counted, to be fearless, not to be worried about their reputations. I know that's a hard thing to do. It's to say, don't worry about your reputation, but I think it's very important. And to think about how you, especially in the first couple of years of college, introduce students in a systematic way to working through very complex texts, controversial texts, that you may not feel comfortable with, and then also writing about them, because this is not, we're all talking about speaking, but writing is a very critical skill, because in some ways, to write things out and then to exchange papers and so forth, in some ways it objectifies things a little bit. It takes you out of the vocality mode. And I think that we've lost traditions of rhetoric here, not only speaking, but also written rhetoric that are very important. But the crisis of the humanities and the crisis of free expression are intimately connected at this moment.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, part of just, part of what I think the humanities often offers, which is pretty unique, to use your colleague Martha Nussbaum's term, is a narrative imagination, like what it's like to be somebody else. That when you read a certain kind of book or walk through a certain argument, even if you don't agree with it, you're like putting yourself in that person's position, and it can really deepen the wells of empathy and understanding. And I think I didn't think about it that way, and I think it is part of the way forward. I guess part of what I would just sort of ask, if I'm also hearing, is that if people really are serious about their education and serious about making a contribution to their education or even a difference in the world, you have to learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. That actually is a capacity that it's hard to sort of lean into saying you want to change things in the world if you're not willing to engage in the discomfort of either challenging the status quo or defending the status quo, and that capacity is absolutely unique, and in addition to developing the self. But it does exist in a way that I think, Suzanne, you were sort of, the cost-benefit analysis seems to have been changed. At one level, human nature doesn't change. I mean, throughout my life, I've usually said, is this a fight that's worth having? I do that with my wife a lot. You sort of go through, is this where I want to kind of like put my stake in the ground? And I think one of the things that when I was working with the students on intellectual vitality was that increasingly what people were feeling is that it wasn't just like low stakes things they weren't talking about or arguing over. It was things that felt more high stakes. In fact, things that felt very deeply important to them and personal, and yet felt like they were self-censoring. And I guess one question for me is, in your educational experience, whether it was in a high school or an undergrad, like what was the moment for you that let you lean into being comfortable with being uncomfortable?
I don't know what was the moment for me, but at this moment, I want to make reference to the disputes that gave legal protections to students in public universities, but then indirectly to private universities. What was the moment at which the courts recognized that students had rights? We know that moment. It was in the early 1960s. It was cases in the Deep South where black students sat in. The key case, Dixon versus Alabama State Board of Education, 9 black students sit in at a lunch counter in Alabama, Montgomery. They are summarily expelled. They get lawyers. A court says that these students are at least entitled to a hearing. From there are subsequent protests. Students have First Amendment rights, and it goes on from there. For me, this was deeply important, and this is a part of the story of freedom of expression in the United States that actually doesn't get much attention. People don't know about those students in the Deep South. Other aspects of the Second Reconstruction, other aspects of the Civil Rights Revolution have gotten much more attention. For me, this is very central, and I think people ought to remember it. And one thing that people ought to remember, this is a story which shows how the struggle for equality was furthered by the struggle for freedom of expression. And throughout American history, those two struggles have typically been together. And I think people ought to remember that.
That's fabulous. Suzanne?
Yeah, no, we think a lot about that, about how freedom of speech underwrites whatever movement you're waging, whether it's for climate justice or racial justice or immigrants' rights. You can't go out and challenge authority on the streets or petition the government or criticize a political leader or a president of a university if you're not protected by safeguards for your free speech. You're going to be retaliated against. And, that's what we see. You were mentioning your trip to Asia. And, we at PEN America do work all over the world, including in authoritarian countries. And, in those places, the hand comes down very heavily if you take to the streets, if you call into question what the government is doing, if you dissent. And it has a chilling effect. There's the universities you were mentioning being in Hong Kong. They used to be very free. They've now come under the heavy hand of Beijing. And it's a very different kind of place and environment. And so a lot of our work at PEN America is speaking to a rising generation of young people and students and explaining that they have a stake in free speech, that this is not some kind of right-leaning agenda or somebody imposing it from the outside, that these are the rights that kind of make possible the life that you want to lead. And we now see with the rash of book bans and legislative restrictions on teaching and learning in higher education and in high schools, it is kindling this awareness that narratives about people of color and LGBTQ identities and those stories are being challenged. And it's because they do, as you point out, they ignite empathy. They help people see things through a different lens. And that's what the book banners are afraid of, that they are part of an effort to transform society and make it more open and more pluralistic and more respectful of varied identities. And so, ideally at a moment like this, we would be able to catalyze a kind of coming together around these principles from the right and the left, recognizing what each has at stake. Instead, unfortunately, I think we're in a spiral, a kind of arms race, where the right is convinced that the university has been captured and that media organizations and publishers have been overtaken by the left, and they're going to retaliate through heavy-handed legislation, through book bans, through now an investigation of Harvard University by a congressional committee that is demanding all kinds of information. Who knows where that will lead? It depends probably on what happens with our presidential election, but it could lead in some really perverse directions along the lines of what you do hear about in other parts of the world. And so I think the stakes are very high. I also say, just to come back to one point, is I do think when it comes to diversity and inclusivity that it's a boon to free speech. If you have people sitting in the classroom who feel, for whatever reason, by virtue of their identity, or their background, that they're afraid to speak up, that they don't have as much authority as the people sitting to their right or to their left, or their lack of schooling in certain ideas makes them a less valid and worthwhile participant, you lose their voice. And if you believe in a marketplace of ideas, that marketplace is impaired if those people feel sort of silenced and intimidated. And so it is necessary, I think, to kind of, in order to allow people to accept being uncomfortable, there has to be kind of a certain baseline of comfort where everybody feels like, they've got a place at the table, they have a chance to speak up, and then they're kind of ready, hopefully, to hear out something that may be unwelcome or even offensive.
I agree with you. I want to add one amendment, and that is that I think because of things that have been happening recently, people across the political spectrum have been awakened and to some degree usefully alarmed. And so one thing that I've seen is people who are self-consciously conservative join up in arms with people who are on the other side ideologically. And the same is true too. The same is true too, that people who self-consciously left liberal have joined up with people to their right, because in both instances, they see that more important than their differences is the specter of the loss of freedom. And I think that that's a good thing, that there's more, that there is a response afoot coming from various parts of the...
Where do you see that?
I'm sorry?
Where do you see that? Like,
oh, well...
an illustration.
Me. No, me. I think that there was a time, not so long ago, in which I thought that people were being really too alarmist. I have friends. Well, I mean, one of the leaders, one of the founders of FIRE, Harvey Silverglate, is a member of this community. And I've been friends with Harvey for a long time, and we would talk, and I'd say, Harvey, you and your organization, man, you guys, you're getting too hopped up. I mean, you shouldn't be as alarmist as you are. Well, that changed over time. I mean, I started reading articles, this happened, and over time, I said, whoa. And I know that, at least for me, I've become much more involved, and not just more involved with the sort of ideological allies that I usually hang out with. I have found myself becoming more involved with people who are considerably to the right of me for the reasons that I indicated. And I don't think I'm alone, by the way. One of the things we're seeing, too, is the creation of and strengthening of new organizations. So, for instance, in the faculty of Harvard, there's a free speech group that's grown up. I understand that at Columbia, I think just yesterday, a free speech faculty group. I think of the free speech alliance that's based at Princeton and other institutions. I think that there is a widespread understanding that we are at a moment where we have to become more attuned to just the things that we're discussing. And finally, by the way, I think that we should really savor this gathering right here. I mean, it's a cold night. People could be doing something else. Yet there are a bunch of folks around who are thinking about this, listening to other people, getting engaged. Good. Let's march on from here and build on this.
That's great. So I'm going to start pivoting to questions from our audience. The way I was thinking about doing this is I have a second hand on my watch. Just turn to 2 or 3 people near you about what questions are coming up in your mind from this conversation, and then I'll just call it, and then I hope students will engage. Is that okay? So introduce yourself really quickly if you don't know the people around you, and then take 2 minutes, all right? Ready? Go. 30 more seconds. Okay, sorry to interrupt the good conversations and dialogue. So love to open it up for questions. We have some mics going around, so if somebody could just raise your hand. Oh, great. Yes, please. Here comes the mic. If you don't mind introducing yourself, if you're okay with that.
Is this recorded?
You don't have to then.
Hi, okay. So I was wondering, you talked about the Skokie March, or the Skokie Nazi March, and kind of how violent, hateful speech is allowed in the United States. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about if violent, hateful speech, say calling for the genocide of Jews, is allowed on Harvard's campus. I'm guessing, where is the line drawn between speech that would be allowed in the public square versus speech that wouldn't be allowed on the campus of a private university, and how do we draw that line?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. Look, under the First Amendment, there is no exception for hateful speech. Like, people sort of say, is this free speech or hate speech? Like, that is not a binary. There's some things that you would probably call hateful speech that would qualify for one of the exceptions to the First Amendment. There are exceptions under the First Amendment for true threats, for harassment, for incitement to imminent violence. But they're really narrow standards. Each of those has a precise legal definition, and much of what we consider colloquially to be hateful speech just wouldn't qualify. And so a public university would have to protect it. There's really no question about that. Now, at a private university, they have choices to make. The government can't dictate what those bounds are, but most private universities, including this one, have their own policies that are quite close to the First Amendment standard and that are quite protective. And the answer that the university presidents gave at that congressional hearing, we were talking about it earlier, and Professor Kennedy said he thought he really liked that answer. And I was not surprised, because when I heard that, I thought that is the perfect answer for a law school classroom. Like, they are correct as a legal matter. But a congressional hearing is theater. It's not a law school classroom. And so people wanted to hear something very different about how reprehensible such a call would be, and how menacing and how inimical to the kind of environment that you're trying to foster at a place like Harvard. And so, those are two different answers. At Penn America, we tend to advocate that private schools come very close to that First Amendment standard. And it really comes to the question of whether you want people in positions of authority adjudicating what hateful speech is and how they will draw those lines. I think the Israel-Gaza conflict has illustrated that so powerfully, because words can mean different things. And if Harvard is going to be curbing and punishing hateful speech, well, what is hateful speech? Like, to one side, it's a political slogan. To the other side, it's a call for elimination and eradication. And I think you have to take seriously those who are victimized or feel most triggered by speech. For them, it kind of lands the hardest, but that's not the only factor. And so, the minute you get into that line drawing, I think it becomes very, very difficult. And that, on balance, as hard as it is to be in an environment where you are going to hear things that are so profoundly objectionable, that it's the better solution. And that, the more we empower our authorities to adjudicate speech, they tend to use that power in self-serving ways.
I think it's a great question that you asked. And one thing about your question is it shows the complexity of the subject. I think one thing that was reflected in the journalistic response and also the popular response to the president's answers to those questions was an impatience with complexity. People thought, oh, how out to lunch the college presidents were. They weren't out to lunch. They were listening. They were answering those questions very precisely, and people were just impatient with them. Now, two things. Number one, you know, you're absolutely right. There's public universities and there's private universities. There are some states, however, that have passed state laws requiring that private universities act in the same way as public universities. So, for instance, there's a state law in California that makes public universities act in the same way it makes private universities act in the same way as public universities. In California, Stanford has to act the same way with respect to freedom of expression as UCLA. So that's one. Two, is that a good thing? I don't think it is. I remember when President Bach here, I guess was maybe 40 years ago almost, took the position that Harvard should act as if it's a public university. I actually wrote at the time and said, I think that's a mistake. Why not have a division of labor? On the one hand, you have public universities that are bound by the First Amendment, regulated by the First Amendment, fine. Why not, at the same time, have private universities that, if they so choose, can diverge? And, you know, let's have some experimentation. Let's see. I don't think that, you know, a uniform standard is, you know, actually, I'm suspicious. I want to resist the call for a uniform standard. Let's have a variety of standards. We live in a very large country. Let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Thank you. Other questions? There's several. Okay, so let's take one from this side. So whoever you want to give it to, you could do a combo.
I start. Thank you guys for this insightful conversation. My name is Nim. I'm a student at the college originally from Israel. And one of the reasons I was so excited for the opportunity to come to Harvard was engaging with people from different points of view in difficult conversations. But already 2 years ago, way before October 7th, to my surprise, a lot of students weren't really happy to engage in or open to engage in these types of conversations. And just to articulate how far away we are from the intellectual vitality vision, it's not only that they did not talk to me and some of my friends who are interested in this type of conversations, it was even difficult to talk about the opportunity of dialogue because students feared the reputational consequences. And I was very lucky to work with Dean Khurana and with the administration on potential initiatives to create spaces of dialogues. I guess one of the main insights we came across over the last 3 years was that changing behavior is hard and it takes a long time. So my question to you guys, and I'd love to hear each of your points of view, is what sort of changes, what sort of actionable steps should universities, including ours, should make in order to, in the future, allow more difficult conversations? Thank you.
Well, it's kind of disheartening to hear that. I'm sure it reflects absolutely what your experiences are, because in some ways the experience of going to college should be exactly the opposite. It ought to kind of blow your mind open and blow everybody else's mind open. And in having your mind blown open, you sort of seek solace in learning to debate difference and to not only understand your own position better, but to have first of all, to have a position to begin with, and secondly, to understand it and then be able to debate it with your fellow citizens. We've been experimenting, you know, we have a very structured curriculum at Chicago. It's called the core curriculum, and it's rather different from Harvard's. It's neither better than worse, but it's different. And so we actually expect students to learn to debate very hard texts and different texts over the course of the first year and a half as part of the central academic mission of the university. But we've also begun to develop a new program called Parrhesia. It's an ancient Greek word for free, but also fearless speech, for our orientation programs and throughout the first year to actually engage in both helping students understand how to speak and write about these issues. It's a kind of like a para-curriculum that will be mapped onto the mother or father curriculum. You can pick your gender. And that we think that this will have a seeding effect, because early on, I think if you wait until the third or fourth year, it's too late. You need to work with students in the first year or two when they come to college, because they're coming out of high schools in which there has been a a sense of homogenization of attitudes, a kind of suppression of different opinions. You need to kind of get that out of the way and get people back into a more kind of entrepreneurial spirit. And I think that there's also a role here for like what I call third-party organizations. So I'm sure Harvard has, all great universities have a lot of places that are associated with religious groups, with other groups, that also engage in kind of systematic work in talking about. So last night I was a Catholic student organization in Hyde Park, in which I was telling Rakesh we had spent a 2-hour debate talking about Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. Now, let's talk about a period piece. This is a 1987 book in which Bloom is complaining about the death of civilization, that you've all been corrupted by Mick Jagger. Do you guys know who Mick Jagger is? Okay. Well, Bloom is talking about your parents, not about you. So your parents were corrected about Mick Jagger. You've lost your way. You don't believe in Benjamin Franklin or Thucydides anymore, and all kinds of bad things are happening to American youth. And now that was in 1987. Okay, now it was a wonderful debate. I'm not here to sell Alan Bloom's book, although he was actually a very interesting guy, professor at Chicago. But this debate was sponsored by a Catholic organization. And Bloom was not a Catholic. This had nothing to do with, but the guy who was doing it, Danny Mess, really interesting fellow, a PhD from social thought in Chicago, ironically. And so it seems to me that there are a number of things that universities can do, especially universities that have the depth of intellectual talent that a place like this does, to actually get hold of the student body in the first 2 years and work with students to encourage this kind of excitement about it. I mean, this place ought to be filled with an electricity of ideas. People ought to have their minds blown up in going to college. Otherwise, because otherwise you're here just to get your ticket punched and get a job. And Harvard does a very good job of saying, you've already figured that one out. I assume you have, right? But how do you open the mind as opposed to close the mind? And I think that there are strategic things that the faculty can do with the curriculum, beyond the curriculum, but again, in the academic realm, that are very important. And if we can't do that, then in some ways this is calling into question the fundamental principle under which we were founded or refounded. We were founded, they were refounded in the 1890s, namely to become a research university. Yeah.
I just, honestly, I think it can be summed up in 2 words, what needs to be done. These principles need to be universalized. Like, this is great that we've got 100 kids here, but it needs to be everybody on campus, and it needs to be institutionalized. It can't just be in response to the latest crisis, and then the crisis blows over and you return to business as usual. It has to be woven in, like the sustainability. It has to become kind of part of the overt, deliberate fabric of the university. Otherwise, I worry that what you've experienced will persist.
There were some questions here. Oh, well, I'll come back. I'll just go back and forth. Is that okay? All right, great.
Hi. Oh, wow, that's loud. Sorry, everyone. I'm Jonathan. I'm a college student. It seems that a large part of this, the speech problem, the expression problem, however we want to formulate it, is basically social. It's about relations between people and their peers or people and their professors, but it's about the sort of interpersonal side of intellectual exchange. And I am curious about how you think about the relationship between the social and the institutional, both the limits on what institutions can do for social phenomena and the sort of potentially counterintuitive ways that they could interact. Like, I could imagine, for instance, that if some kinds of speech can't happen in a seminar room, they're more likely to happen in a dining hall, where there's not, it's not as direct as the institution facilitates speech and then speech happens. I'd like to hear you talk about the weirder parts as you think about them, about the interaction between the institutional and the social as phenomena.
I think your comment underscores the complexity of what we're talking about, and the difficulty of what we're talking about. So, for instance, let's take a word, ostracism. Now, I think in many of these discussions, ostracism is viewed as a bad word. People are engaged in ostracism, And I think that, you know, the connotation is that that's bad. Sometimes it's bad. I think oftentimes it's bad. It's not always bad. I think there's a good sort of ostracism. I think that I could say things that would warrant me being ostracized. Now, I think that we need to have a conversation about under what circumstances that is so, but I think it's a mistake to, again, iron out things and simplify things and, you know, suggest, for instance, that there's, you know, no circumstances under which somebody ought not be ostracized. I think we have a better society because there are some things that people know not to say, and people know not how, you know, people avoid acting in certain ways because they would suffer a real reputational cost. Good, good. We have a much more decent society than we used to have precisely because of that. Now, can that go overboard? Yes. Can people draw lines in the wrong way? Yes. All of that should be subject to contestation, and we need to talk about all of that, but I think we need to be open and say that, yeah, we need to talk about all of that.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of one observation that I've noticed in terms of hearing about what the experience is like on this campus and certain other campuses in recent years, which is the campuses have become much more diverse. You know, the composition of the student body has changed pretty dramatically from what it was like, you know, say when I was here in the 90s. And yet I think the interactions have also changed. I think there's an impulse, it seems to be an impulse in some ways to sort even harder. And that the people come into school, now they know people from social media, they know who they're connected to. They find those and make those bonds. And I don't know if there's the same kind of melting pot that there was when I was here, when sort of your freshman entry was, you know, those are the people you ate with for many months. And I think part of it is that people are nervous about how to interact with somebody very different and where that could go wrong. And, you know, it's easier to avoid it. And how, you know, question of how we give them those skills so that, you know, the question they really want to ask, but they're afraid of asking because it might be offensive, you know, they sort of shut it down. And, you know, that inhibits the creation of intimacy when you know, the burning question in your mind is one that you can't ask. And, you know, I agree with you that ostracism has its place, but I think, you know, the question is proportionality, right? You want proportionate response. And in the society we have, and particularly with social media and algorithmic amplification, you can't calibrate that. That can spiral completely out of control so that, you know, something that might deserve ostracism for a week could yield ostracism for a lifetime.
I totally agree. And on the question of, like, for instance, hurt feelings. On this question of, for instance, you know, people sort of saying, people asking a question, and then the person who, the sort of the target of the question sort of gets indignant. How dare you ask me that question? What are you talking about? We're, you know, one of the reasons for having people from all over come is for people to ask you a question. So, you know, why should you feel indignant if somebody comes up to somebody else and says, listen, you know, I'm gonna tell you the truth, I haven't been around people like you before. And I haven't been around people who, for instance, have hair like yours. How do you do your hair? Now, there have been some, you know, press reports about people getting really indignant when somebody says, you know, now I'm insulted. I think there should be a discussion in which we say you shouldn't feel insulted. I don't think that's out of place. You ought not feel insulted. Somebody said that they didn't, you know, they were ignorant, they didn't know about this. They're just asking you a question. You can answer their question and you can ask them. Well, you know, tell you the truth, I haven't been around people like you before. So, you know, I got a couple questions for you. So at the same time that I think ostracism is a force that we need to talk about realistically. I think the flip is also true. When do people's feeling of indignation and hurt itself becomes a problem? I think people ought to knock it off. But again, that's something to talk about. There's going to be, differences of opinion about that. But all of these things, it seems to me, have to be on the table, and we ought to get, we ought to be fearless in grappling with them.
There, and then, John, you want to go ahead? And then.
No, I was just going to say, I think it is the case. You come to college, you move into the dorm, you meet a bunch of kids, and then that becomes your group. And then if you plot friendship formation, then it becomes kind of slowly distended, and you make more. One of the things we've done in Chicago is, because we're under the quarter system, we were able to have a very large investment in new study abroad programs. So over half of our students now spend a significant part of their junior year going with fellow students abroad 3 or 4 months with a group of faculty members. And what this does is kind of it gives them a whole new group of friends in Hannah Arendt's sense, friends who talk about shared speech that matters, but in a third-party environment. So you're all there, maybe different identities, different backgrounds, but you're all learning that in Italy, when someone says 10 o'clock, they don't mean 10 o'clock. And all kinds of other cultural and social differences. It's fascinating, and it does have a kind of re-energizing and a kind of re-cosmopolitanizing effect on the student body. So my use is, every university has things at its opportunities to use structure and curricular innovation and faculty expertise to address these kinds of problems. This is just one example of things that we've done, and it's been really quite stunningly effective in accomplishing it.
I can see in my mind's eye, because suddenly everybody's like bonded together, because look how different it is over here. And I know that when I've talked to the colleagues who've run kind of international programs, it's amazing what that does. Suddenly everybody finds everything in common they had, rather than focus on the differences. So
Hi, thank you for joining us. My name is Alex Bernay. I'm a junior at Harvard. When we talk about intellectual vitality, I think we're actually talking about two things that are very closely interrelated. The first being freedom of speech, the legal and policy protections around our ability to say things, but the second being intellectual diversity, the actual presence of people with very radically different viewpoints. And I think Harvard does a remarkably good job at the legal protections around freedom of speech. But I wanted to ask a little bit about intellectual diversity. I think this is really the area where improvement is necessary. The Crimson does a study of faculty and students when they are admitted to Harvard, and I believe 95% of Harvard faculty are on the left to some capacity, and a similar percentage for newly admitted Harvard students. And I think that really raises issues in fostering an environment that's conducive to these types of conversations that you've all referenced, because so many Harvard students and faculty are ideologically homogenous. So I'd really like to hear your all takes on how we address increasing ideological diversity on campus.
Well, I can just, one example that I think is kind of relevant, to come back to Alan Bloom, and the issue back then was kind of multiculturalism and the collapse of Western civilization. There were these big fights at Stanford about killing off the Western Civ course. This is kind of 1980s, early 1990s issues. It also involved issues of free expression. And one of the things that it seems to me, if you look at the panorama of European history, so from Plato to NATO and back, okay, there are ways of reading the European past, just because I say that as a Europeanist, and you could read it from a left or a right perspective, but really that's a rather boring and rather kind of well-trodden path. Most of my colleagues at Chicago have a totally different way of approaching, different ways of talking about the European past that are not in these kind of traditional ideological political categories. And I think it's, we feel, and this emerges from the variety and diversity of the scholarship that informs these courses. So, I mean, one of these, I think it's very important to remember these universities were created as bastions of original scholarship. And scholarship is exciting, it's creative, it's path-breaking, it's disturbing. You learn things and you write things that are very different from what you believed, and then you share that with the students. And so that at least the way in which we've taught our course in Chicago, it's very, almost using the same books, but very, very different narratives. And then we try to explain to the students self-consciously why it's different and how exciting it is that it's different. And so I think it's, in some ways, I agree with you. We're certainly being typecast in this kind of left-right phenomenon. I think the faculty need to break through that and say, this is not the way we think. Who we vote for next November has absolutely no relevance to the way I'm teaching Thucydides or Raymond Williams or Alan Bloom.
Thoughts on the ideological diversity?
I think, well, I would agree very much with what my colleague just said, and to go back to the question of, the alleged ideological homogeneity. A couple of questions ago, in fact, your colleague who's right next to you was saying that the divisions were such that people could not even talk. That seems to be in tension with the idea of ideological, homogeneity. I mean, there seems to be a whole lot of division on the campus, and so it's difficult to see if that's true, then what's the homogeneity story? I think maybe we need to be more attentive to the various strands of, difference that are actually here. At least in my life at the law school, in my classes, I've been there for 40 years, lot of ideological difference, lot of vigorous discussion, and so I want to be attentive to, the questionnaire evidence, all aspects of evidence, but I am somewhat skeptical of the claims that we're in a totally, left liberal bubble.
So I think we're at, somebody just tell me, is this we are at time, yeah. So, okay, this is supposed to be the beginning of a conversation, not the end. There's so much that you've all shared with us, and I was just trying to put myself in the place of going back to the motivations of what it means to be free. And one thing that's clear to me is that what's not freedom is saying something you don't necessarily believe in because you feel pressured to say it. And what's also not free is speaking your conscience, and somehow, because you spoke your conscience, I understand the ostracization, but I think in some ways it can shut down learning because you might not do that again the next time. And in an educational institution right now, I think at this moment, we all have this important responsibility, do we believe in what institutions like ours stand for, which is that ideas matter, that if we bring people together from different backgrounds, experiences, through their dialogue, through their discussion with books, through their discussions about books with each other, through their discussions with each other in and out of the classroom, that a better understanding of the world emerges, but also a better understanding of each other. And I think one of the things that's coming out also I'm hearing is that there's a lot of us who have to be responsible. The faculty have responsibility here. Our structures and how administrators might structure the educational experience has a responsibility here. We have a responsibility here. Students have it toward each other, about how they approach each other with maybe more inquiry rather than just advocacy. And if we don't do that, this thing that we value, which we might have taken for granted for too long, could be in danger. And I think that I'm really grateful for, first of all, our amazing panelists today. I'm grateful to all the students for the activities. I'm grateful for the administrators who organized this and the other activities that are coming. But the thing I heard is that this is also a long march. This is not something that is going to happen overnight. This is sustained attention that we all have to work toward, starting maybe even the beginning of the educational process, but certainly also launching people toward the end of it. And so if we could give a round of applause to our wonderful panelists, to yourselves, to our questioners. And I think everybody's still on for dinner, right? Okay, good. Well, okay, good night.
Invite me to come back to talk about the Calvin report.
Okay, yeah, and we'll bring John back to talk about the Calvin report. We're gonna have him on many conference calls about that as anyway. Thank you, everyone.